All right, friends. Boy, that was like magic. That was great. All right, friends, welcome. And thank you so much for coming this evening. We're kicking off our mental health series. That's going to be it's just a fantastic thing. We've started on Sunday morning, been giving it some attention in some other areas. Those who have made this series happen should be thanked and recognized. If you notice them, there's a whole committee. It's headed up by our own Dr. Melanie Dobson and Reverend Bill Roth. They've given great leadership putting all this together. There you are. And there are a whole bunch of things. There's a brochure that looks like this on the table over here. It's also online on our church's website. All the stuff that's coming up, it's other big presentations like this. It's small groups, it's workshops, it's all kinds of stuff that's going on. There's actually an all-day mental health training. That's the other card that's on the table over there that you may want to avail yourself of. And so this is cool. And it's an important thing for all churches to do. It's important for our church to do. And your turnout, your being here, says a lot. It says that you care about this, you understand that it's important, and I'm just glad that you're here. Thank you for giving your time to come. Our biggest thank you, though, tonight should go to Justin Perry. Justin, he's the guy sitting over here next to me. And I told Justin I didn't prepare a big flowery introduction for him, and he said, you can rip me in the intro if you want. That'd be fun, in a way. What I can say about Justin is this. When we put our heads together and said, if we could get anybody we wanted to kick off this series, who would we want? And we said, we want Justin. And we prevailed upon him to come, and we're just glad that you're here. He has a counseling practice here in town. He's just done a lot of amazing things, and some of that's going to come out as we talk to each other. But Justin, welcome. Thank you for, yeah. Justin and I met and worked on this ahead of time so I could queue up, all the right questions that I know you're curious. So, like, what's your favorite color? No, that's not the question that we're asking.
Carolina blue.
I walked right into that. Kind of dumbly. I avoided saying we failed to mention where he went to school. We'll just leave all that alone. Justin, we're here to talk about mental health, mental illness. And it's one of those things that everybody kind of knows is important, but nobody knows quite what to say about it, how to respond to it. Some people live in kind of a naive, sheltered world, and they think it's somewhere else. Talk about, like, how pervasive is mental illness in our society?
Now, when we talked the other day, I think one of the things I said is, we talk about 6 degrees of separation. Well, mental health, I feel like it's 2. The reality is that in this very room, I'm going to say everybody in here has been touched by mental illness in some form or fashion, whether it's directly, whether it's a family member, whether it's a friend, whether it's a neighbor. It's impacted all of us, but sometimes we just don't realize it.
I mean, is mental illness something like you have it or you don't?
What I always say is it's kind of, I look at it more, instead of it being a light switch, it's more kind of a dimmer switch. So, when we talk about percentages, we'll talk about 1 in 4 people are likely to develop mental illness. But beyond that, there's a lot of us that may exhibit symptoms either way. So whether you're talking about anxiety or whether you're talking about being in a really deep funk, there's a thin line sometimes between clinical depression versus just I'm struggling. But so I think it's one of those things is that it's not just kind of I've got it or I don't. It's more how am I functioning right now? And so at some points you may look like you've got everything together, but at other times we're struggling a little bit.
And a lot of those who are really struggling are the ones who are good at looking like they've got it all put together, right? I know when I'm preaching, sometimes I look out at you guys, I could just say the word anxiety, and 2/3 of the faces in the room just go white. Like we know these things. We know these things. So something that we want to work on and think about is this whole business of stigma that gets attached. But why? Where does that come from? I mean, why is there stigma attached to mental illness?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just lack of understanding. You know, it's one of those things that we don't talk about. And so I'm one of those people that I'm all about breaking down the stigma, and so part of it I even try to do it with myself. Like, I'm very open about the fact that I've dealt with depression and anxiety in my own life. And I say that publicly, I say it with my clients, just because I think what happens is we don't understand it, and so when somebody is experiencing mental illness, they feel like they can't talk about it. And so when I can't talk about it, and especially if it's something like depression or anxiety, it grows, you know, and so I start to turn inward. And I tend to isolate. And what I say about both of those illnesses, they're kind of like bullies. You know, when I'm by myself, that's when they're going to beat up on me the most. But the irony is that when I'm highly anxious or I'm highly depressed, what I think I want to do is be by myself. You know, but then you take it a step further, because we don't talk about it, I feel like I don't have anything to do but to kind of keep it to myself. And so I think part of what the value of doing something like this is to say that, you know what, it's okay. Yes, I've dealt with mental illness. You know what, I'm gonna guess there's some people over here, some people over there, nobody has to raise their hands, who've dealt with mental illness in some form or fashion. I think if we look at breast cancer, for example, so now we're at a place where we have a month and we recognize the value of the color pink and everything else, but that happened over time. You know, when women first were having breast cancer, there was a huge stigma. There was this idea that I'm not a full woman. You know, there were all of these things that kind of kept people staying quiet. But fortunately, there were some folks who experienced it and realized, okay, I'm not alone. I talked to one person, I talked to another person, and even in this little group, we realized, well, if it's impacting us, it's probably impacting other people too. And so my hope is that with the series you guys are doing here at the church, we can start the same way somebody comes and says they had a diagnosis of cancer. Well, we rally around them. We put our arms around them. We say, hey, I'm gonna pray for you. Hey, do you want me to bring over a meal? Hey, do you want to talk? Well, somebody says, I have depression. I found out my kid has bipolar, schizophrenia, you know, addiction. Why can't we do the same thing?
Indeed. We're going to learn how to do the same thing. Thank you for sharing that. The stigma works two ways, I think. There's kind of the stigma that other people will attach to you. There's also kind of an inner stigma. There's kind of a shame and guilt. I talked to a woman the other day, as a matter of fact, who suffered really severe postpartum depression. And what she reported to me is, you know, you have a child, and the motto is you're supposed to be, oh, just giddy, happy, and I'm so in love with my child, and everybody's so happy and sending photos. And she was so profoundly depressed, and then that's compounded by the guilt, right? Because you're supposed to be like all the other moms, feeling giddy, happy. You're supposed to look at your child and say, oh, she's such a darling, let's go. And the feeling inside is very different, so then you get the shame and guilt. Talk about how does that work, shame and guilt?
Right. So, yeah, I laugh about that because I think about, you know, I have a 4.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, and the pictures that we post on social media are not necessarily those dark moments that we're talking about there, you know. So we all experience them, but very rarely are we posting those pictures on there. We're posting the pictures that make everybody look cute and great and make all of our friends want to go out and procreate and, you know, not to realize that there's some hell behind it as well, but we keep that a secret until they join us in that. But, you know, I think one of the things, you know, we were talking about that, and so with guilt and shame, they're two different things that sometimes we kind of weave together as one. And so with guilt is something where I've done something wrong, and I recognize an action I did that was wrong. It's something I can atone for. It's something that I can address. Now, shame is more of an internal thing. It's that I am the wrong thing. and when it's internal that way and we turn inward that way, it often leads to 4 potential options. One is avoidance. Another is attacking myself. Another is attacking others. And the last one is withdrawing. And so if you listen to those 4 options, how many of those sound like good options? Right, it's a trick question, 0, But if you think about it, and that's why I said I can easily think about my own, journey when I was isolating in school. Eventually it starts with just kind of avoiding phone calls, avoiding friends, avoiding class. But you also can get into that attacking yourself mode. And you kind of have that negative self-talk, and you start talking yourself down. For some folks, it's attacking others, lashing out. I always say one of the ways I know the difference between somebody who's genuinely confident versus somebody who is putting on a facade with arrogance is if somebody's attacking other people. Because if you're confident, you actually don't need to tear anybody else down. You feel good and you want to lift other people up. But if I'm tearing other people down, it's probably because I'm a dressed up trash can like we talked about before. The last thing is the withdrawing. And withdrawing is just, I don't come back. I don't come back to church. I don't go back to school. I don't go back to my AA meeting. In the most severe form, it's suicide, But I think it's important to realize that, again, a lot of us have shame-based behaviors. And when I even go to that attacking myself, we talked about kind of the language of negative self-talk. But we also have other things like eating disorders, cutting behaviors, and even just getting drunk or high. I always tell all my clients, I work a lot in addiction, it's like, let's think about some of the words we use to describe it. Getting hammered, get smashed, get obliterated, get blanked up. I'm in a church, so I'll keep it G-rated, And it's like, if I said that those things that happened and drugs and alcohol weren't involved, you would think, man, somebody got their butt kicked. And it's like, yeah, I got my butt kicked by me. I was upset with James, but instead of me feeling secure enough to confront him, I decided that I'm gonna go drink a 5th of vodka and then throw up all night and have a headache the next day. So I've actually really attacked myself. And so I think it's one of those things to realize when we start talking about shame and guilt, these things are really pervasive throughout our culture.
So it seems to me over and over, there's so much wisdom in all of this, and some of it may be a kind of learning a kind of mercy and patience with other people. Somebody's obnoxious to you or whatever, and you tend to go, ooh, but they're most likely going through something themselves, and to remember that, it kind of has a calming effect. This whole thing about being alone, a book that some of us talked about was by an Episcopal priest who opened up to her congregation about having depression, and the church just couldn't deal with it at all. And her book is titled, "Darkness is My Only Companion." So this whole thing of being lonely, a couple things that have been said to me in my lifetime as the pastor here. I saw a woman, this was years back, and I ran into her at the Harris Theater, and I took my life in my hands and said, I haven't seen you at church lately. Sometimes I do this, and they say, I was on the front row Sunday. It's like, and I say, it's harder than it looks. So I saw, she said, yeah, I haven't been lately. She said, I've been having just such a dark, terrible time. She said, when I get better, I'll come back to church. And I understood that, but yet it made me sad. And then, Justin, you don't know this, in my sermon on Sunday, I reported on somebody who spoke with me just this past week who quit coming to church a long time ago. That's because she battled some just really terrible, dark things. And when she exited, she said, nobody called. Nobody. And so this kind of dilemma, like you have somebody who's withdrawing, but yet you know that what they need is not to be alone. So how do we as a church think about the isolation of other people? We met the other day, you talked about dependence and independence and talk about that some.
Okay. So, yeah, I think I think there's so many layers to this. So there's the piece that's about how we handle it, but then there's also the piece about how we're socialized to be. And so one of the things that I say often, that sometimes I work with, a lot of young adults as well, 15 and up. And so sometimes that includes parent work. And sometimes the parents get thrown off when I say in one of the first sessions that independence is BS. You're like, what? That's pretty much the whole thing I'm doing is raising my kid to be independent. And I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty much gonna undo what you've been teaching your kid every time you send them here. So, and so why I say that is because we're brought up to think that there's this dichotomy, either I'm independent or I'm dependent or codependent. And again, it's a myth. There's no such thing as people who are sustained that are independent, that are self-reliant, self-made. These are great myths that we tell ourselves, but again, they're BS. Yes, I can stand on my own 2 feet, but what I've learned is that I can stand on my 2 feet stronger and longer with the support of others as well. And so when we talk about interdependence, it's the combination, me as an individual, but also us. So to be a grammar nerd, so instead of being kind of first person singular, we're talking about first person plural. And for folks in here that are familiar with 12-step work, one of the things they'll say is it's a we program. It's not all about I, it's not all about me, it's about us. And so I think the more that we can socialize each other along those lines, it helps somebody feel safe in seeking out help versus I've got to get better to come back to church. Well, the truth is, if I'm trying to get better by myself, I can't heal my brain with my own brain. Sometimes, very often, it's going to require the support of somebody else. So what we want the church to be is a place, is a community. Whereas, you know what? It said come as you are, right? Well, guess what? I'm coming depressed today. I'm coming anxious today. I'm coming ashamed because I relapsed the other day. And what I want this place to be is a place that says, hey, I don't fully understand, but I love you. I'm glad you're here. Tell me what I can do to help. You don't have to have the answers. You just have to create the space.
Yeah, I always recommend against, when anybody tells you anything, I always recommend against saying, oh, I know how you feel. Because one, you don't know how they feel. Like maybe your spouse died and somebody else's spouse died and you say, oh, I know how you feel. You have no idea how they feel because their relationship is unique. So you don't shut it off by saying, oh, I know how you feel. You open it up. Tell me more. And maybe they can't tell you more, but we can still love, can't we? What causes mental illness? Simple question.
This is what we've been waiting to hear, right? Is it my fault or is it Dad's fault, right? Who did it? All right. So, both. All right. No. All right. So people get caught up in nature versus nurture, and I'm a person that's nature and nurture. When I was in undergrad, I majored in psychology, which is the individual internal part, but also double major with sociology, which is more the environmental piece. And so my master's was social work, which was person and environment. And so there are things that we all bring to the table based on genetics and things like that. Some of us are more predisposed to depression, to bipolar disorder, to addiction. However, it tends to be some environmental things that can either kind of kick off that first episode. And so sometimes I may always be susceptible, but maybe I don't actually have the stressors that kick it off. Or I can be somebody who went a long time kind of just hanging on, and then the right thing just happened and bam, the line is really thin. And so it's a combination, again, of what we all pass down. I do understand that for my kids, genetically, based on me, there's some things that are going to be in place for them. You know, that's the reality. However, there's also things that we can do environmentally in terms of teaching them how to cope, teaching them, again, this is part of why I'm all about the interdependence, you know, which is saying that, hey, you're more at risk. Mom, grandma, dad, uncle, all are alcoholic. Doesn't mean you're definitely gonna be there. However, you're at a higher risk getting wasted with your friends at 15 than somebody else. That's just the reality of it. So when we talk about cause, it's the combination of, again, I've got things that make me susceptible, but typically are there certain events and everything else that help trigger an initial episode? Stressful events.
Yeah, I remember talking with a therapist of one of our children, and she kept asking me about our parents. That was really fascinating to me. And I said, well, my children, they don't really know my parents that well. Still wanted to know, right? This stuff still matters. Isn't that interesting? I mean, the Bible talks about that stuff visited the third and fourth generation. I mean, that's kind of a prehistoric way of beginning to think about that. I want to get back to the social things you mentioned in a minute, but first, you're talking about what you studied and all. So how did you get into this work?
So, you know, it was a journey. So I went into Chapel Hill. Actually, my plan at that point was to the University of North Carolina, home of the Tar Heel State, right here. Great institution. But so I went there actually with the plan of being a civil rights lawyer. I actually grew up here in Charlotte, and in the midst of desegregation and the court case, the Capaccioni case that was going to end desegregation happened when I was in high school. And there were friends of mine that were at West Charlotte that actually went to protest at the courthouse because we knew that it would lead to eventually what we have now. And amongst the people who were part of us being down there were James Ferguson. And so I saw James Ferguson, and I was like, man, I want to be like, that's what I want to do. And, you know, I shadowed at a law firm, and I was like, that's not what I want to do. Let me know when the big court case is, and I can go talk, and we'll do that. But yeah, so you know, I was there, and again, a lot of great things about Chapel Hill. Loved it, but also there's some challenging things as well, and especially if you're a person of color. And through a lot of my life, I had always worked to kind of try to be a bridge between different populations. And sometimes that was a bridge between two sets of people who didn't like each other. Sometimes it was a bridge between white folks who had a certain perception of black people and everything else. And in a way, I think I kind of had owned that as something that I wanted to do. You know, I was very inspired by folks like Martin Luther King and everything else. And even though I realized much later that he's way more radical than we actually acknowledge him to be. But that was one of those things I felt called to do. That said, while I was in Chapel Hill during what we call my first sophomore year, the year that is not on the books, but I was up there, and one of the things I realized was I started feeling like, am I being tokenized? You know, I had friends that, again, they loved me, but they would still make kind of passive-aggressive, kind of racist comments towards other black folks, you know, because you're not like them. You're different. Like, oh, you think that's a compliment? No. and I got to a point where I said, am I actually doing more harm than good? And I had a couple of other black friends, one who's actually at State, and he and I, we used to talk about our Malcolm phase versus our Martin phase. And I was like, dude, I'm feeling very Malcolm right now. I'm just done with him. And that's really where I was at that point. And so when we talk about that first depressive episode, I kind of had a crisis of conscience. It's like, am I actually undoing what I think that I want to do? And next thing I know, I find myself not going to class. I find myself shutting down, and again, not planned. And at that one point, I actually made a rational decision that I was going to flunk out at Chapel Hill and transfer to a historically black college or university. And again, a rational decision that I was going to flunk out and transfer to another school. This is why isolation and sickness is not good, you know? And so that's why I laugh with my clients all the time. I'm like, guys, yeah, trust me, I've had some really messed up thoughts too, okay? I get it. And so there was one friend who kept pushing, and she kind of, at one point, I was screening calls. She actually came by and said, we're going to go to lunch. Because what I had been doing was I would just put my hood on, go to the cafeteria, grab my food, head back to my cave, AKA my dorm room. And she said, no, we're actually going to go out and eat. I was like, okay. And again, this is somebody who was a very social person all my life. And I told her my plan, and she was like, this doesn't really sound like you. Don't you think you should talk to somebody? Hadn't really thought of that. And so talked to the dean. They said, go home, do some work on yourself. You can take some classes in the summer. We'll see if you can actually hack it. And if you can, we'll let you back in. So, I did. I went home, 20 years old, too old for the high school kids, not really old enough for the other scene, living at home with your parents, not a fun time, all right? and so I was fortunate. There was a woman, Joanne Stratton Tate, who I had gone to school with her daughter, and actually we'd done some of the other planning stuff around the desegregation stuff before, who said, I heard you're looking for a job. Well, I work at a place, United Family Services, and you can come answer phones, and we'll see if we like you, and you can see if you like us. So I did. I went there, and I was answering phones. I went to a general meeting, and there were folks there that were counselors and therapists, and they had this degree called the MSW, the Master's in Social Work. And so I was like, well, let me look that up, because I did a lot of helping friends before. And I saw that you could do therapy, but there was also a social justice element. And I was like, whoa, they made up a degree for me, you know? Clearly a little bit self-absorbed at that point. But so I was there, and that kind of shifted my course. I went back, aced my classes, had the best GPA I ever had. Ended up using that in my personal statement when I applied to grad school, and I decided that I wanted to kind of give back what I had gotten. And, the ultimate irony is the girl who did that was someone who I'd known since second grade, and we'd always been friends, but eventually she's now my wife and the mother of my kids, And so, so when I tell clients that, I believe in hope, it's because I've actually lived it out. My darkest days led to a lot of the brightest things in my life as well.
So what's the most rewarding part of your work?
Just, I think, seeing the light bulb come on for somebody else. I think one of the things about in this work and sitting in this seat while somebody else sits in that seat is that lots of times you can see potential in somebody else that they can't see in themselves. And so it's like, oh, I know you can do this. Well, it doesn't really matter if they don't know it. But then when you actually see it take hold and you hear them say something, it's like, oh, you actually have been listening. You see them put something in the action, and you hear them say, man, I feel so much better. Or, that thing we talked about, it actually really worked. Well, good, But that I think that is the most rewarding thing for me, is literally seeing somebody else go again, same way I did, from a really dark place to a place where the light comes on, and knowing that there is a way out.
So Justin, I want to turn to some kind of broader social questions. I was on the telephone the other day with Dr. Warren Kinghorn of Duke, who's going to be speaking. He is from Duke. It's okay. A balanced perspective.
Yeah. Sometimes you got to settle. It's okay.
Warren is going to be with us in a couple of weeks, and one of the things that he and I got to talking about is that a lot of times we think that mental illness is something that happens inside an individual, and it's just kind of their individual problem. And he's, in his research, he's gotten more and more interested in how there are things going on in society that you as an individual, you as the people that you know, all of us actually wind up getting caught up in, whether it's anxiety. We live in an anxious culture. I think right after the election of 2016, whichever side you were on, everybody was in a mood, right? Everybody was in some kind of anger, something was going on with people. So I want to talk about some social things. We have in our church over the past couple of years tried to do a better job of talking about race in terms of our relationships with other people, in terms of what's going on in the city of Charlotte. What would you say about race and mental illness?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to race and mental illness. So one of the things this answer may take a few different directions. One, I will say that there's a significant discrepancy in how we treat mental illness across races. And it starts very early. Even just in child behavior. My wife works in early childhood. And, my mom was a teacher. She taught what used to be called BEH, which is Behavior Emotionally Handicapped, and now I think it's EC, and I think there's a couple other designations. And so from the time I was young, I can still remember being right around 5 years old at First Methodist. That's where I went to child care. And there's a good friend of mine, Stephen Poole. And he and I used to play, and he was white and I was black, clearly, and we used to play Dukes of Hazzard. There's so many layers again, I was like, I got older and I was like, riding in the General Lee, some good old boys. I'm not the target demographic here, but we just thought it was cool that you got to jump in the cars and get out and everything else, and so we played that, and there was one girl who actually, she used to kiss me, and we called her Daisy, and then we found out Daisy was her cousin, so there's so many layers. Again, it just gets really deep. I won't take us any further down that rabbit hole, but yeah. James was like, please, switch courses. So I remember on picture day, we took a class picture, and Stephen was like, let's make some goofy faces. And I was like, okay. And so we made some goofy faces and brought the picture home, and my mom was livid. And she said to me, words I can still remember to this day, even though I didn't fully get it then, you can't do everything they do. And, and so there's some people that would say, she should allow your child to be innocent and everything else. And, well, the reality is society doesn't allow kids that look like me to be innocent. There's studies that show that by the time a black boy is between 4 and 5, that he's already making that transition from cute, innocent thing into threat. And so when I think about mental illness here, I worked at Thompson Child and Family Focus for the first 5 years after undergrad. It's a great organization, and I absolutely love it. Actually, there's someone, Allison Todd, who I asked to come out here. She's a therapist now as well, and she was my first clinical director. But one of the things I remember there was that we have all these kids that have severe trauma. We've got kids that are from inner city. I've got kids from Russian orphanages. I've got kids from the suburbs. I've got kids from rural areas. But I can still remember often when it came to the black kids that there was often conduct disorder, oppositional defiant diagnoses, whereas with the white kids, they were more post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was like, well, the trauma, well, that kid saw his dad get shot at 2. You gonna tell me he doesn't have trauma? The language that would get used as, well, that's street behavior. Street behavior. Let's break this down. And again, it wasn't, and this was not just white professionals that said it, there were black professionals that said it as well, because again, a lot of this stuff is so internalized, the dehumanization of black bodies. And so I think people in this country, we always say we need to just get over slavery and everything else. And it's like, well, at some point, we need to really, really educate ourselves on it and how it's truly impacted us, and even the lens that we look at things through. Again, it's not about vilifying anybody in the room. It's not about anybody feeling ashamed or feeling guilty. It's saying, let's look at the fact that we had people who were treated like livestock and beaten, separated from families, treated completely as inhumane, later, even after being free, being hung in trees, having body parts auctioned off after being killed, to the point that my grandmother, who lived in New York, my brother was choosing between Morehouse College in Atlanta, which is a historically black college amongst a conglomerate of other HBCUs, and Chapel Hill. And my grandmother in New York said, "You need to tell him to go to Chapel Hill. He doesn't need to go down to Georgia. It's dangerous down there." And I was like, "Grandma, it's all us where he's going," you know? But again, the trauma, that's the thing people don't get. You know, it's like, well, why are you so angry? Why are we so angry? Let's flip the script here. How did you feel after 9/11? Felt pretty pissed off, right? Pretty scared. Now, if you think about the black experience here, there's been constant trauma after trauma after trauma. Laws change to maintain trauma, but we want to hear, like, get over it. Wow, okay. All it takes is one 9/11 or one O.J. Simpson verdict, and we lose our minds. And yet we can watch killing after killing after killing, and we're supposed to just kind of let it go. So I speak kind of frankly, you know, again, I benefit from this society, so I'm not somebody who's disconnected from opportunity. I'm in the midst of opportunity, and yet I still deal with a lot of the same anger and frustration. But I also watch in our field, again, a kid that looks like James, we're gonna recognize a mental health issue first. With James' addiction, well, that's a public health crisis, because, you know, the opiate epidemic, that's a public health crisis. Well, now that it's not the heroin that was in Baltimore, you know, crack was not, you know, and so again, we arrest over here, we give treatment over there. And if you ever really want to understand discrimination in America, go work in drugs. Because you'll learn who uses the most drugs versus who gets arrested the most for drugs. And they look very different, you know? So I think that's why I said there's multiple layers. I think part of our work is trying to rehumanize, and actually humanize for the first time, the black body in this society. And in the same humanity and the same empathy that's given to our opiate addicts, which again, I have immense empathy for. It's not that I want to take away the empathy for them. I want the empathy to extend as well to folks that are black and brown that are dealing with the same issues.
What about poverty?
It's huge. I've had a very diverse work experience. I've done work with folks from inner cities here in Charlotte, but I've also worked in Stanley County, Albemarle. So that's rural poverty. So I've seen inner city, primarily black and brown poverty, but I've also seen rural, primarily white poverty as well. And the thing is, it shows up very similarly in that there are these intergenerational struggles. And if you think about it, when you're not getting your basic needs met, well, yeah, that's gonna impact what you're experiencing here. But collectively, when I think about those of us sitting in this room, again, a lot of us, I can't speak for everybody in here, but a lot of us are doing okay. I'm gonna make an assumption. Is that a fair assumption? Okay. But I think it's important for us to look at how the decisions we make also impact the folks that aren't doing okay. Because again, lots of times there's a lot of trauma when you're constantly being evicted. I mean, if I don't know if I'm eating, if I don't know where I'm gonna live, that impacts my brain. My brain goes to fight or flight mode. And so when we talk about kids that have short tempers and short fuses, well, yeah, when I don't eat, I don't eat the same oatmeal I eat every morning. If I don't eat it, and by the time 10 o'clock rolls around, I'm not that therapeutic, you know? So I think to me, I look at it two ways. I think that it's important that we make sure that folks who are in poverty get access to care. I don't pull punches too often. So, you know, the thing that's happened with Cardinal here in our community, and when I worked in Stanley County, I worked under that system. It was Piedmont Behavioral Health then. But what's happened with Cardinal is a lot of hoarding of money that has been designed to go to our poor and most vulnerable kids lots of ways. But there's a message that's being sent. Like, we send a message to these kids, whether we realize it or not, which is we don't really love you. We don't really care about you. And yet we're hoping that they're gonna turn around and love this city. That doesn't really add up, guys. They pick up on things, and the conversations, when you talk to kids, they're pretty raw. I started this morning, I'm doing a couple of groups at West Charlotte High School. And there was a young lady there, just in our initial time of talking, and she was talking about all the different things she had to do, all the different hats she had to wear before she even got to school. And of course, she's there because she's coming back after a suspension. Again, her fuse is like this. She wants to go to college. She actually said, I want to show my younger siblings something different than what they've seen. So again, the myth that they don't care, that's a myth. There's a difference between not caring versus not seeing something as a viable option. My parents went to college. It seemed like a viable option. For a lot of folks in here, if your parents went to it, well, yeah, it seems viable. But what if everybody around me, all my peers and everything else, none of us have ever seen that as a reality. But we're supposed to believe in a dream that we've never seen materialize.
You talked about poverty. Let's talk about affluence.
So
you see this in your work.
It helps me pay my mortgage. Yeah. You know, I think essentially one of the things I think probably drew, I think one of the things that probably attracted me to you or vice versa, James, I think is that I was one of those weird people that when we worked around school desegregation, everybody started talking about concentrated poverty. And I talked about that as well, because it's detrimental. It's detrimental to the kids. It creates high turnover. But I also talked on the flip side about concentrated affluence. Like, nobody talks about that. It is highly detrimental. You know, and I actually have a financial disincentive to say this, because as long as we keep building neighborhoods and schools exactly the way we are, I'll be able to put my kids through college on the backs of that. You know, over here with concentrated poverty, what we're looking at is rat races about survival. But in concentrated affluence, what we're often dealing with is a rat race around competition, sometimes around image, sometimes around materialism. And again, all these things, they all seem great, but at the same time, when I'm working with folks and I'm seeing that our greatest opiate epidemics are in our top-ranked schools, when our highest suicidality rates are in our top-ranked schools, you know, in our Zillow 10-point schools or grade A schools, like I said, if there was a social-emotional skill, those schools, most of them would drop from A's to C's. It's not the drugs you have to worry about in our poor schools. And when I went to West Charlotte, we had a running joke. It's like, okay, you go to West Charlotte, you have a mixture of kids there. Well, okay, yeah, you go to a party, there's gonna be weed, there's gonna be alcohol. There's gonna be some random guy who does acid by himself, freaking out. But now, when I would go, and again, I'm very clear not to say names of schools because people get kind of very sensitive. But when I go to all the schools that everybody here is desiring to go to, that you're fighting in school board meetings to make sure you don't get rezoned away from, you know, well, I remember being 16 years old, and parents loved me because I was always a designated driver. I went to parties because I liked girls, but I didn't really care about getting high or drunk. So I would take my mom's minivan and I would pack some other kids in there, and they knew their kids were safe, and we'd go to parties. And I still remember going to a party after one of our friends transferred to another school, and there were kids that came from desirable schools and private schools, and I saw the usual. There's alcohol here, oh, there's weed here, and I walk into another room, and there's this white powder all over the table. Well, as a black man, that just says jail to me, and so I was like, if you're riding with me, we're out. And the thing is, it's still the same thing, it's just now it's heroin. But again, part of one of the things, I actually got asked when I first started saying this, there was somebody who indirectly, not to me, they said to me, you can let him know he can't say that in South Charlotte. And I was like, the blank I can't. I grew up in this city, I know this city probably better than you do, and it was an issue then, and it's a bigger issue now. And I say that again, saying I have a financial disincentive to say this. I don't take insurance. I do out-of-network billing. I don't charge a low rate. Who do you think is paying that? You know? So social workers are weird. They tell us that, they're like, yeah, we want to work ourselves out of a job. If I had the MBA, I would not be telling you guys this. I'd say, you know what? Send your kids to that school right there. And here's my card. Call me in a year. You know? But I think it's really important, though, that we have to start getting honest. We have to get honest about the full health of our city. Our issues are not just poverty and economic mobility and the limited perspectives there. We have an issue with concentrated affluence and limited perspectives there. And those kids are suffering. They may come home with great grades. A lot of them were cheating very hard to get them. I actually was just talking to a young lady that's at UNC Charlotte that talked about her experience in one of those schools. But again, it stays a secret. Going back to that shame and that stigma, there tends to be a pressure in environments, you know, such as ours. I need to maintain an image. I need to send out a great Christmas card. I gotta tell everybody that my kid is going to this school, even in childcare. Yeah, they teach Mandarin at my kid's childcare. Dude, it doesn't matter when you're babbling, it all sounds the same, right? Your kid's not that special, like, but it's what we do. The rat race starts so early. I mean, and I think we have got to slow down, take a step back, and actually look at what's happening to our kids. And why am I fighting to get my kid in this school? And is it as great as we think it is? You know? And we gotta have an honest conversation about having a broader definition of what success is. You know? Because again, it doesn't matter. I work with Ivy League kids. I work with folks from Duke, you know. I work with plenty from Chapel Hill, you know. So, I mean, so the idea that just because you get into a great school, that means that you're gonna have a healthy life, that's a myth. And in the grand scheme of things, when your kid is in the hospital, whether they overdose, or your kid is somewhere because they've attempted to end their life, you're not gonna care anymore that they were number 5 ranked kid in a great school. You're gonna want your child to be alive. So we gotta have some real hard conversations, and my style is I'm gonna say things that are gonna make people uncomfortable, because when people are uncomfortable, they move. And our city is a city that has dealt with a lot of comfort. I'm actually grateful for the discomfort we've had in the last couple of years, because I think we've been in denial. And so I hope today that when I say some things that may sound uncomfortable, don't take it as something to feel ashamed about. There's nothing to be ashamed of, guys. We're human. But take it as something to maybe motivate me to look a little bit differently, look a little bit deeper. Hey, realtor, why are you trying to push me over here? What do you really know about that school? Oh, nothing. You've never been in the school since you graduated. So I say that again because we're going to have conversations around not in my backyard and everything else. I think we got to really look at this because, again, we think we're protecting our kids, but we're actually isolating them in the belly of the beast many times.
And from my perspective, I would add not just kids, but adults.
Absolutely.
The impact of affluence on our adults who are in our church. You don't see it because everybody dresses up and they look fine when they come to church, but oh my goodness. So much pain and so much stuff going on. Something else we've heard a lot about just in the past week, interestingly, regarding society, is it's hard to believe, isn't it? Another school shooting, another act of public violence. And as I said Sunday, the only thing that says violent as the violence is the violent way we talk about it. People yell about guns and it's not guns and all that. Well, a lot of people have said a lot the past week about mental health and mental illness. Talk about that with respect to the violence that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's a running joke amongst some of my clinical friends and I. It's like when a mass shooting happens, it's like, oh, everybody's going to pretend to care about mental illness again, you know, because frankly, lots of times it's a distracting point away from the other part. But I also think the biggest problem I have with it is that there's so much false information that comes out about it. Folks who have mental illnesses are way more at risk of being harmed by gun violence than they are of delivering gun violence. The vast majority of them, if they're going to do gun violence, it's to themselves. I think we have to shift the conversation to looking at things a little bit deeper. Well, most of the time when we're doing this, who's doing the killing? Are we talking about women or are we talking about men? Right. And yet, there are way more women with mental health diagnosis than men, excuse me. That doesn't really add up. So to me, I think we have to have a more comprehensive conversation around what we call toxic masculinity. You know, that is at the core of what's going on. That's what's at the core of domestic violence. That's what's at the core of sexual assault. That's what's at the core of these mass shootings. And with toxic masculinity, what we do is we socialize boys to feel as though we strive for dominance. We strive for self-reliance. We devalue women. You know, and we are taught to suppress your feelings. There are a lot of guys that basically take pride in the fact that I can stay rational through everything. That's not always a rational thing. There's a reason why we have more heart attacks and, again, die, sooner than women. Again, we push our boys into this very early thing of, hey, don't cry about it. Man up. What exactly does that mean? You know? The way I say it is you got to tell on your disease is going to tell on you. And so very often what happens is we teach boys to not tell on their disease, but it tells on them when they're abusive with their partner, you know, when they become depressed, when they become suicidal, or unfortunately, when it comes to mass shootings. And so I think we've got to have a different conversation about what masculinity means. You know, sure, standing up and being competitive, that's a great thing. Wanting to support my family, that's a great thing. But domination, suppressing emotion, devaluing women, and again, trying to be this self-reliant guy who doesn't need anybody, I don't need anybody else. You know, again, look at our suicide rates in men. And I'll speak, you mentioned the racial piece. And I think, honestly, it challenges, I think white men, unfortunately, are even more at risk because there's this weird message that happens. Often they're kind of socialized, the world is your oyster, right? Which is great when everything works out. But when it doesn't, 70% of suicides are white men, of middle age. Why? Well, because we sell this idea that you alone can take your destiny in your hands and you can conquer. Well, what happens when I lose my job? What happens when I get laid off? What happens when my wife leaves me and all these things? And I don't have a village to lean on. And heck, it's not even that I don't have a village to lean on. I've been socialized that I need to stay away from building a village. And now it's just me and all of my irrational thoughts, some of which say that the world will be better off without me.
Hope you're hearing the profound interplay between what goes on inside an individual's head and what's going on in our society, right? Just the American dream, but then the impact that has on people. Public anxiety, the impact that has. Let's talk about something. This last question I want to ask you, and then let's talk with these folks. We're in a church, so let's...
I've been trying to keep it G-rated,
Yeah. Justin, by the way, he's part of the second coolest denomination in Charlotte. He's Presbyterian. They're pretty good. He belongs to Covenant Presbyterian Church. Let's talk about God. When I hear people talk about struggles that they have, usually when they come to me, they're wanting to attach God to it, understandably. And they'll ask me questions like, why did God do this to me? Or, why hasn't God healed me from this? Or, I had a heartbreaking email from a guy a while back. I reported on this in one of my sermons, who he emailed me and said, I've battled terrible depression for years. And I've prayed and prayed, and I thought if I just prayed hard enough, if I were just holy enough, I'd get better. And the beauty of the email was, he said, it's finally, the light bulb had come on. He said, I finally just realized, I'm just depressed. That sounds like a negative thought, but actually, talk about God. How can God be, or the way we think about God, be a problem within mental illness, mental health? And what role does God play in this?
So, great question. So, I'll speak somewhat as a clinician, but I'm also going to speak somewhat as a human and talk about my own piece. Again, I grew up in Little Rock AME Zion Church, and I was highly engaged there. We only had one person give the sermon when you were a high school senior. I gave the sermon, and I was FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes president, all these things, about my faith, and I'm out in the open about it. I'm an athlete, but I'm going to be a different athlete, and I'm proud of this, right? And most of my life, I was able to kind of solve my own issues, And when I was there in Chapel Hill in that dark period, I do remember praying. I do remember asking God, why? What do I need to do? I remember all of these things, and I still struggle. I still struggled. I couldn't pray my way out of it. I couldn't rest on the laurels of the good things that I'd done. It still was taking me the same way it was taking anybody else. And, I know there's a saying we talk about, obviously people always come back to the whole faith without works is dead piece. But one of the things that I've realized is that God also puts people in our lives. We're relational. So yes, we have a relationship with God, but we also have a relationship with other people. I mean, if you want to go back to the most basic of Adam and Eve, right? And so I think the way I look at it is I don't use the phrase that everything happens for a reason. I think that's a dangerous phrase. It is a potential landmine. But what I do try to say is that I hope to find something of value in every experience I have. And for me, when I think about the role of God, I think my faith is important, but I also think that part of it is still connecting and having community here on earth. The whole relationship can't be about the one beyond. I've got to connect with people here. And I also think the other piece is just sometimes remembering that God, the God I believe in, is a forgiving God. And I think that's one of the challenges. I work a lot in addiction, so a lot of the folks that I come in, honestly, for a lot of them, they got a very judgeful, scornful, painful experience with God that contributed to their addiction, which contributed to them not wanting to ever step back into a church. And so for a lot of them, they'll talk about when doing the 12-step work, it's like, well, that was the first time I really experienced God. And I get it. And I say that to me that's an opportunity for us to also reevaluate how we're doing faith. You know, why is it that a bunch of us dressed up, sophisticated, highly educated, great individuals that do great things can come to a beautiful building and not allow folks to feel welcome and feel safe to come in there and lay it out on the table? Meanwhile, a basement of drunks and junkies, their words, can actually help these people see God in a way that we never have. To me, that's a reality check for us. Because what they're doing, again, I'm really not in position to say, but when I think about it is they're doing faith right. What I need to figure out is what is it you guys are doing, and how can we do that more effectively?
Yeah, and I always like to think about what is a church anyway? And sometimes I think in our minds we think a church, it's like, because we talk a lot about being a member of the church. Some of you know I don't like that term. I don't like to talk about members. I don't give preferential treatment to members. Because what we're doing when we do that is we make the church into it's a club. And you're a member of the club, and it's a club of like-minded, kind of spiritually focused people. And it's fine. It's not wicked or anything, but it has some problems. We don't want to be a club. What we want to be, actually the way the Bible describes it best, I think, is the Bible says we're the body of Christ, and you have to contemplate that. Somebody says to me, I'd like to meet up with Christ. You know, what I want to say is, come to church. Because I've told you that Teresa of Avila prayer, she said, Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Like, the church is amazing. Like, it's way the heck better than being a club. We are, or at least supposed to be, Christ to other people. So this isn't like just a thing, well, I don't need God, I also need people. It's the people that you need who actually are Christ. So, yeah, well said. Justin agreed to, we're going to field a couple of questions. Let me say before I ask you for questions, is that I am interested in questions. Last Monday night, we had a program, it was fine, and the speaker, Michael Waters, said, are there any questions? And the answer to that actually was no, because what we had were some extended speeches from people. And speeches are fine, except in this case, no one will be able to hear your speech. So what I'd like is, do you have a question for Justin that we have not addressed that you'd like to hear him talk about? Yes.
You talked about your practice and that you said that you don't take insurance, you do billing. So what does a regular person do, especially maybe senior, I'm talking about other people I know, seniors that have mental health issues that maybe they've not addressed or that have come up because of life experiences. Where do they go for help?
Great question. And so yes, I'll repeat the question. Question she asked was, because I don't do in-network insurance billing, so I'll do what's people pay me and then they can file with their insurance to get reimbursement. And she said, so what do people who can't pay for that, what do seniors and folks like that do when they need help? And I think it's an incredible question because that's the majority of my career, that's where it's been. I think there's a couple of things. One, beyond folks that do insurance, there's a program called Open Path Collective, and that's Open Path, P-A-T-H, Collective, like as in a collective body. And on there, folks do discounted sessions that can be as low as $30 a session. And so one of the things that a lot of clinicians, the same way lawyers do kind of pro bono work, there are folks that'll do that. Conversely, I think some of it is also us that are in the field better marketing what each other does. So one of the things I try to do is I try to have a list of people that are referrals that I can refer to as well. So if I have somebody that I can't accommodate that way, then I will say I know these people who can provide this. On the flip side, for me, and I don't necessarily have a target for seniors, but one of the things I try to do, and part of actually why I do things the way I do them financially, is that it gives me space to then go and provide services to folks who can't. I was telling James earlier that I'm running a couple of groups at a local high school, West Charlotte, where I went to, that I'm not getting paid for or whatever. I mean, I don't know, it can turn into that, but I went saying, hey, I want to help without having to worry about money. And so there's this weird dance where it's like I need to figure out how to make money to pay for what I want to, but also when I got into this field, what I wanted to be able to do was to kind of impact folks who didn't have access to services. So Open Path Collective is one thing. Also ask people if they have a sliding scale, because a lot of folks will do a sliding scale. So even if they have a number that they charge, they may take a certain amount of folks that they'll take a reduced rate, and they'll do it based on your income, sometimes based on their comfort level and things like that. So even if you don't know, call somebody. We also have a group of social workers and therapists that have a Facebook group. So if somebody calls me and I don't know the answer, I'll put on there, hey, I've got a referral that's looking for this. Does anybody know who can serve them? And then we can kind of get back to you. So what I would say is if you don't get the right answer the first time, don't give up. But yeah, so look at Psychology Today as a general thing, but Open Path Collective is something for affordable services.
Yes.
So you touched a little bit on the stigma within the African American community, and I won't say I'm discouraged, but we have a lot of work to do as I look out at the groups. The group that's represented here is only a few African Americans. You talked about how cancer was gradually destigmatized. What do you suggest be done in order to gradually initiate that destigmatization of mental illness within the Black community?
So that question was about the stigma of mental illness within the African American community, and which for a lot of folks may not realize is actually even more pronounced than it is within the white community. And she was asking, what do we do to start to kind of gradually chip away at that, the way we talked about with cancer and things of that. So there's a couple of things, and some of these are things, I'm speaking to things that I'm doing, but things I want to do collectively. So kind of the same thing is really starting to push awareness, pushing it through the churches as well, because a large part, again, that pray it away, well, there's a reason why that phrase is in my head. It didn't come from nowhere, right? It's it's this idea that I can pray it away. But I also think that, I think collectively we have to start having conversations about our experiences. And when I say our experiences as black folks, so again, there's experiences somebody may have that's poor and black, but even somebody who's affluent and black, when you're the lone black representative in a room on a regular basis, that becomes lonely. That can become tiring, and so helping kind of create spaces around that. So I'll just speak very generally to a couple things that I'm doing. I've actually reached out to several other black clinicians here in the community to talk about doing some of this and trying to create more of an open dialogue around it. So we're not necessarily going to call it mental illness right out the gate. We're going to just talk about mental wellness and kind of ease folks in. But I'm actually also working on writing a couple things for the paper and everything just to kind of get it out there. But I think folks such as yourself who do have a desire to do it, I think the more of us that kind of come together, I think the same way that it's starting to become destigmatized here, or the way that if you look back at AIDS in the 80s with the white community and white men especially, eventually things kind of shifted there. I think that that part of why I tell my story is to break it down and to say, hey, look, this is not, like, we had an idea that it's just crazy people, right? And that's not even a word that's in my vernacular, but I think helping people break that down, I think there's some work that we can definitely do around that, and I'm definitely glad to talk to you, because that's something that I'm committed to doing right now, and part of why I've switched to private practice, to have more free time to do those kinds of things.
Cool. Another question? Yes, back there, yes.
Can you speak about the use of medication in the treatment of mental illness?
Absolutely.
Good, bad, effective, not effective?
Sure. So the question was about speaking about the use of medication with mental illness and positives and negatives. So I would say right out the beginning that I do believe that medication is a part of some people's process. So again, I'm not somebody who's going to say, that everybody needs medication. I'm not somebody who's going to say nobody needs medication. I had a client when I worked in Stanley County who, it was textbook schizophrenia, and he was determined to try to take certain herbs from a place down the street who kept pitching to him that they would work. And I was doing a serenity prayer over and over again, because I knew they would land him back in the hospital, which it did. So what I say is medication can be a part of the journey. I also think it's important to recognize that a lot of times we do a lot of our own self-medicating as well. And so when I have clients that say, well, I'm scared to take any medications, I'm like, you've done heroin, you've done coke, you've smoked this laced with that, you're scared of what? No, I'm scared, man. You're way, way braver than I am, But I think sometimes for them, it's helping them kind of re-look at it and say, it may not, the first time it may not get me where I want to be. I kind of have to have the same resilience with drugs and alcohol. Well, I didn't get where I wanted to be on that first high. Well, I kept going at it until I got there. And when I had a bad experience, I didn't stop. I just said, maybe I did too much, or I got a bad batch. So I tell all my clients, you have all the same skills for recovery, you just already been using them in addiction. And so I think recognizing that medication can be a piece of it. So I tell anybody, if you tell somebody you don't need medication, no offense, maybe offense, but stop. You don't know. You don't know. And I love that you have a holistic life. I want that for other people. I have a lot of friends who practice natural medicine. I support them. For some people that works, but for some people they need a conventional medication, and we have to give them the space to feel comfortable taking it without feeling judged. Does that answer your question? Okay. I saw a hand down there.
Yes.
Thank you. I would like to answer one question that was asked back there. We came back to Charlotte in September of last year, and I called 29 resources and found no one who would take Medicare Blue Cross Blue Shield. No one, not one person. And they weren't particularly polite about telling me sometimes. And so I do know that if you're in the hospital, if you get bad enough to be in the hospital, they'll take it. And then I have a question. I would like to know how is the best way for people who do have mental illness to be able to tell that to other people that are in the church without like, hey, you know, I have mental illness.
Scarlet letter M on our chest, right?
And I, for one, have been one of the people who have avoided people, left churches, because I didn't know how to do that. I have been many a time on the sofa with my head turned to the back under the covers. I said, I just can't go today. How do people tell other people? Now that all of you know.
I was gonna say you actually just did a great job.
I have been in, and I'm not trying to make a speech, but I have been in the dark rooms where you use, in some of the basements, where you even sit in children's chairs. I have been where there is a cross-section of black, white, Hispanic, rich, poor, and we are able to help provide for each other.
So the question is, how do you tell people? And, you know, clearly, as I think you should be able to do this. Like if on Sunday morning we say, oh, stand up and greet your neighbor, that you could turn around and say, I'm battling depression. You ought to be able to do that. But it's like anything else. If you'd just been diagnosed with some kind of odd cancer, you probably wouldn't share that with somebody at that point, right? So you kind of look for your spots, but I think what's sad is when people know one another well and are in regular settings with each other. They're in a Sunday school class, they're in Bible study, they're next door neighbors, whatever they are, and we still never tell, right? And what I always try to just encourage people is like take the chance, take the risk. More often than not, if you share something with someone, they're so relieved you told them this because they got something to share back. Occasionally, you'll share it with somebody and they'll be like, oh, like you got cooties. And if they do that, you know, bless their heart, that's not going to be your friend. And you can kind of feel sorry for them. But so at some point, just I think we need more risk taking. And I don't know that there's the right language per se, but it's always confessional. Like Justin did this, right? He told his story, right? I went to college, things were good, but then it just got really dark. And what was that like, right? What do you think about that?
So I'm actually I'm going to take a risk right now. And again, everybody do whatever you feel comfortable. So if you've ever experienced any kind of mental illness in this room and you feel comfortable, raise your hand. Okay. So to me, even this, you know, and if you had a chance to look behind, there's a lot of neighbors whose hands went up in there, right? And I think sometimes even simple things like that, and for those of us that are in this space, because I think part of it is how we tell our stories. I deal with that with my clients all the time, and I tell them, I'm like, my confidence in that has evolved over time. I didn't come ready-made, just being able to walk people in the eye and say, yeah, I dealt with depression and anxiety, whatever, get out of my face. I didn't come that way, you know what I mean? It's been a journey getting to the place of being able to own my story. What I say is find a phrase or a couple of phrases about you that you feel comfortable owning, but also understand this too. It's a piece of your puzzle, it's not your entire puzzle. Like my mental illness does not define me. It's a part of what makes me great in some ways and a part of what makes me terrible in other ways, you know? But it's a piece of me.
And there's no one right answer to how many people do you tell and how soon do you have to kind of know this about yourself. Like I've thought about people with cancer. They really vary. Some people, they've got prayer chains all over the country. They've got bumper stickers on all their neighbors' cars. And other people, they want to carry that pretty privately. Now, it doesn't mean they're alone, but it may work for them that, there's 7 people that know, and that works for me. So you have to decide what works for you, and who are you, and how much of it is your identity. Nicholas Wolterstorff wrote this wonderful book about the death of his son when he was 23 years old. It's a beautiful, moving book called Lament for a Son. And one of the things that he says in there is that he's found out over time he can't go too far with another person before he has to tell them, I'm somebody who lost my son. Because it's so big and so raw for him, he can't know you for a year and then tell you this. Like he's got to pretty quickly get to that. And you just have to know that within yourself. I think with mental illness, the bigger malady that we see is just sheer privacy. I mean, no, you just can't tell. Let's just own it. You're not all part of our church, but I know this church. This is a hard place to tell these things. This is a very hard place to tell these things. Sometimes I've had this happen, and I know others who've had this happen. You try to tell something, and it's not that somebody's ugly, they're actually kind. But it's a pity. And I don't think anyone wants to be pitied. Like, oh, poor thing, right? Like, too bad they didn't. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So people will be kind, but nobody wants pity. What people want is love and understanding and a sense of our common humanity here.
And can I just speak to one more thing on that, James? So going to your question, I think there's a piece of what, and it ties into what you just said, there's a piece of what I say, but really, to me, I think the onus for those of us in this room it's how do we respond? Because that's where the shift is. Because if we shift the way we respond the same way that, we celebrate Susan G. Komen and everything else, what's your name? Susan. It's something in the name Susan, all right? So again, we get to a point where we celebrate that. It's not, again, breast cancer did not start out as something that people walked around wearing pink bandanas and advertising, And so I think the onus is on all of us that are in this room, if we at least agree to, if somebody says it to me, maybe I just say, thank you for sharing that with me. So I don't have to have an answer, but just maybe give them a hug and say, thank you for sharing that with me. And they hear that and it's like, you're safe. Because that's really all they're looking for, is I'm looking for a safe person.
And as religious people, the way to make a safe place unsafe, and this applies to mental illness, but also applies to other illnesses, is to try to say something hopeful about God, right? Like, God's got a plan. Somebody dies, they say, she's gone to a better place. Everything happens. All these just stupid, I'm sorry, they're stupid. And they're stupid because they're untrue about God, but almost all of them are actually cruel to the person you're saying them to. So don't do that. You don't have to give theology. You don't have to give answers. You don't have to give a pithy statement that will cure the person. If they just would listen to you, like, oh, if you just have a positive attitude. I hear this all the time. People have like stage 4 colon cancer. Somebody will tell them, oh, if you just have a positive attitude. People battling deep depression. People say, I'm sure if you just have a positive attitude.
The depression took that away, right?
Like,
I had one.
What? So don't do that. But what people are always happy to hear is, I love you. Mm-hmm. You matter to me. People don't mind being checked on. Send people a note. I was thinking about you. I love you. Don't give them trite answers. But so I hate to do this. We're at 8 o'clock and we're a good bit past time. I'm beyond grateful for you for coming. This has been a really attentive group. Look at these guys. They're still an hour and a half. Yes, thank you. You've applauded yourself. Well done. That's great. Way more importantly, though, let's express our gratitude to Justin for being with us tonight.